It was supposed to be the voyage of a lifetime, sunlit decks, endless blue seas, and a promise of Mediterranean serenity. But within 48 hours, laughter turned into hostage pleas, and champagne flutes shattered beside the sound of gunfire. No one suspected that evil had boarded alongside the tourists. But it had, and it came with demands, bullets, and one brutal murder that would shake the world. The Achille Lauro stood tall against the Mediterranean horizon, its white hull slicing through calm waters like a blade through silk. The ship had been at port in Alexandria, Egypt, and as passengers wandered off to explore the pyramids under the desert sun, a handful of men quietly made their way aboard. They blended in, simple clothes, nondescript expressions, just more tourists on a floating city. No red flags. No security checks worth the name. Just a brief nod at the gangway and a glance at a clipboard. No one paid attention. Why would they? It was the 1980s. Terrorism happened in conflict zones, not on cruise ships. What those men carried in their small duffel bags wasn't sunscreen or souvenirs. Inside were Kalashnikov rifles, hand grenades, and handguns. Their mission was not joy or escape. It was retribution. They had boarded not as passengers but as executioners. As the ship pulled away from shore, a sense of quiet luxury returned. The music started again in the lounge. A few stragglers returned to the buffet. The remaining 97 passengers, mostly elderly couples and staff, settled in for a calm evening. But inside cabin 109, the hijackers unzipped their bags. The time had come. They waited for the perfect moment, just after dinner, just before dusk. When the corridors were dim and laughter still echoed faintly from the dance floor. Then the silence broke. A steward opened a door and came face to face with a rifle. Screams followed. Orders barked in Arabic. Panic erupted. Passengers were herded into corners of the ship. Crew members forced to their knees. The ship's captain, an aging man with decades at sea, was dragged from his quarters at gunpoint. No one knew exactly how many hijackers there were. Some said 4, others whispered 6. Fear distorts reality. The only certainty was that the Achille Lauro was no longer a cruise ship. It had become a prison. Over the intercom, the demands came fast and clear. The release of 50 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. The message was relayed to authorities. The ship was now a bargaining chip in a geopolitical game. And everyone aboard was a pawn. For the hijackers, this wasn't personal. They didn't care who the passengers were. Elderly or young, foreign or local, it made no difference. Their mission was to make noise, to be seen, to be taken seriously. But in the process they needed leverage. And that leverage came in the form of innocent lives. The ship drifted. Port after port refused it. Syria wouldn't let them dock. Lebanon wanted nothing to do with it. Israel denied comment. The sea, once beautiful, now felt endless, like a trap. There was no escape, only negotiation or blood. Inside the ship, terror took a different shape. The air grew thin. People whispered in different languages, prayed in silence. The hijackers roamed like wolves, watchful, tense, unblinking. Every sound made passengers flinch. Every word spoken too loudly earned a rifle butt to the ribs. Even the crew had no idea what would come next. The captain, forced to steer with a gun at his temple, held the course toward nothing, praying someone, anyone, would intervene. Then something changed. The hijackers realized their plan was unraveling. No country would take them in. Their demands weren't being met. The world was watching but no one was blinking. They had expected fear to move the needle. Instead, they were stranded, with nearly 100 people they could not use and time slipping away. That's when they made a fateful decision. They singled someone out. They looked for a message, not a casualty. They chose not the youngest nor the strongest. They chose the weakest, an elderly man in a wheelchair. His name was Leon Klinghoffer, and his fate would soon echo across global headlines. But at that moment he was just another passenger. Helpless. Alone. Easy to move. Easier to kill. The plan was no longer just about demands. It was now about consequences. But that would come later. For now, the ship remained suspended in time. The hijackers waited for a response that never came. The hostages sat quietly, barely breathing, uncertain if they would live to see another morning. And above the endless dark of the sea, the world turned silently, unaware that a floating city had become a chamber of fear. The infiltration had worked. 4 men had walked aboard a cruise ship carrying war in their bags, and no one had stopped them. Now the price of that mistake would be measured in blood. His name wasn't announced. There was no speech. No ceremony. Just the steady creak of a wheelchair rolling across the deck of a ship that had become something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Leon Klinghoffer, a 69-year-old man confined to a wheelchair by a stroke years earlier, had spent most of the cruise in quiet observation. He wasn't loud. He wasn't threatening. He didn't even speak much. But in the eyes of the hijackers, he was the perfect symbol. American, Jewish, vulnerable, and ultimately disposable. By now, the terrorists had realized their plan was deteriorating. Their demands hadn't been met. The ship had been circling the Mediterranean for hours, turned away by ports and governments unwilling to become part of a volatile international spectacle. The world had learned the Achille Lauro was under siege, but no one was coming to save it. The silence of diplomacy had left the hijackers exposed. They needed to escalate. They needed fear, pressure, headlines. And so, they made a choice. Klinghoffer had argued with one of the terrorists the day before. Not aggressively, just a firm, dignified protest. He had told them that their cause didn't justify violence. That innocent lives shouldn't be used for political ransom. That they were cowards hiding behind guns. No one else on board had spoken with such defiance. And for that, he was remembered. But also marked. Two of the hijackers approached him late in the day, weapons slung across their shoulders, eyes unreadable. No one tried to stop them. How could they? Passengers watched in frozen horror as the chair was rolled through a corridor, past crying families, trembling crew members and blood-stained stairwells. It made no sense to anyone. Why him? Why now? They didn't explain. On the upper deck, the sea stretched endlessly in all directions, still deceptively calm. There were no cameras. No audience. Just ocean wind and silence. The hijackers paused near the railing. Klinghoffer looked out into the distance. There are no words to confirm what he said, if anything. Some believe he pleaded. Others say he remained quiet to the end. Maybe he knew what was coming. Maybe he didn't. The gunshot rang out like a hammer cracking stone. The body slumped sideways. A streak of blood trailed down the chair's arm. One of the hijackers kicked the brake off the wheelchair and together they lifted it. There was no ceremony. No burial. They tipped him overboard. The splash was almost gentle. Some passengers didn't know what had happened. Others realized instantly but refused to believe. 4 hours, the murder wasn't officially acknowledged. But the atmosphere changed. It turned heavier. Even the terrorists grew quiet. Something irreversible had been done. Down below, Klinghoffer's wife, Marilyn, searched for her husband. She asked the crew. She asked the hijackers. No one would answer. When she finally learned the truth, it wasn't from the men who pulled the trigger. It was from whispers, from the look in a steward's eyes. Her husband was gone. Murdered. Thrown into the sea like cargo. International response was immediate, at least in words. News of Klinghoffer's execution raced through newsrooms. Governments issued statements. Protesters filled streets. His name became a headline before his body had even washed ashore. But aboard the Achille Lauro, it was still just another night under a hostage regime. The murder didn't free the Palestinian prisoners. It didn't earn the hijackers any safe passage. All it did was mark a turning point. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. For the rest of the hostages, everything felt different. Every shadow became a threat. Every footstep echoed louder. The hijackers became more erratic. Tense, paranoid, silent for long stretches and then suddenly shouting, waving guns at no one in particular. They knew the world was now watching closely. They knew their message had been delivered, soaked in blood. Eventually, negotiations resumed. Not public, not televised. Quiet calls between governments. Deals whispered between diplomats. Promises made, some never meant to be kept. The Achille Lauro would eventually be allowed to dock. The remaining passengers would walk away. But one man would never return. And his absence would become the most damning evidence of what happened aboard that ship. Leon Klinghoffer was not a soldier. He wasn't armed. He wasn't a symbol until they made him one. In killing him, the hijackers transformed a faceless hostage crisis into a moral reckoning. They didn't just take a life, they ignited a firestorm. His murder would be dissected by journalists, memorialized in art, protested on stages, and invoked in debates for decades to come. But in those few minutes on the deck, none of that mattered. What mattered was that evil made a choice, and the sea swallowed the consequence. When the Achille Lauro finally docked, the nightmare appeared to be over. The passengers, tired, dehydrated, emotionally gutted, were released. The crew was silent, eyes hollow. The hijackers, surprisingly calm, stepped off the ship and handed over their weapons to Egyptian authorities. No gunfire. No last standoff. Just a strange, sterile surrender. But it wasn't over. Somewhere above the Mediterranean, in a Washington, D.C. briefing room dimly lit by satellite maps and redacted files, President Reagan was being updated in real time. One American had been murdered in cold blood. A U.S. citizen, disabled and unarmed, executed and discarded into the sea. The press was calling for justice. Congress was roaring for answers. Reagan didn't want diplomacy. He wanted results. The terrorists weren't being jailed. They were being allowed to walk. That was the deal Egypt had made with the PLO behind closed doors. In exchange for ending the standoff peacefully, the hijackers would be granted safe passage to Tunisia. It was a deal made in shadows, the kind that governments justify as necessary. But to the United States, it felt like betrayal. The four hijackers and their orchestrator, a man known only by the alias Abu Abbas, boarded an Egyptair commercial flight bound for North Africa. They thought they were safe. The mood was almost relaxed. They had survived. They had made headlines. The mission was over. What they didn't know was that they weren't alone in the sky. Somewhere far above, U.S. Navy F-14 fighter jets had taken off from an aircraft carrier stationed in the Mediterranean. The pilots had one mission: find the Egyptair flight and intercept it before it could disappear into Tunisian airspace. Radar locked in. Coordinates verified. Orders clear. As the Egyptair plane flew over international waters, the American jets approached from both sides like predators in formation. They didn't fire. They didn't need to. Over the radio, the message came firm and cold: divert course immediately and follow us. The pilot didn't argue. He knew this wasn't a request. Within minutes, the aircraft was redirected to a NATO base in Sicily, Sigonella. And as the wheels touched down, the air around the base grew electric with tension. American commandos surrounded the plane from one side. Italian forces, already stationed at the base, rushed to the other. Two NATO allies, both claiming jurisdiction. One crime, two governments, each demanding control. Guns weren't fired, but fingers trembled near triggers. The standoff wasn't just military, it was political. Italy, proud and sovereign, refused to let American soldiers extract prisoners from its soil. The United States, furious and grieving, refused to let the killers of a U.S. citizen walk free again. Hours passed. Negotiations grew tense. Inside a darkened control room, decisions were made that would never be written down. In the end, Italy prevailed. It was their base, their land. They would handle prosecution. The Americans stepped back, but not happily. The hijackers were taken into Italian custody. Abu Abbas, however, was not. Somehow, amidst the chaos, he slipped away. Some say it was a loophole in the paperwork. Others claim it was intentional. Either way, he boarded another flight and vanished. The fallout was immediate. Italy was criticized for letting him go. Egypt was condemned for giving him safe passage. The U.S. was applauded for its bold move, but also questioned for nearly triggering a crisis with an ally. The standoff at Sigonella became one of the most dramatic and diplomatically embarrassing episodes of the Cold War era. Back home, the Klinghoffer family watched in disbelief. There was no closure. Only delays. Trials dragged on. Sentences were handed down, but none felt sufficient. The man who had ordered the killing was gone. His name would appear in court transcripts, political speeches, and eventually, obituaries. But for years he remained untouchable. Still, the message had been set. The skies were no longer safe for fugitives. The ocean was no longer a hiding place. Justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied forever. In 2003, nearly 2 decades later, Abu Abbas was finally captured by U.S. forces during the Iraq War. He died in custody the following year. No trial. No final reckoning. Just a quiet end for a man who once orchestrated a hijacking that stunned the world. But the scars remained. The Achille Lauro incident reshaped how nations dealt with terrorism. It changed aviation security. It strained alliances. It showed how, even in a modern world of diplomacy and treaties, vengeance could still rise from the ashes of silence. And at the center of it all, a cruise ship that set sail for beauty, only to become a floating battlefield. A flight that was never meant to land where it did. And a wheelchair left adrift in the endless sea, carrying with it the weight of the world's failure and the beginning of its reckoning.